23rd of September, 1944. Somewhere over the Netherlands. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilot never hears it coming. One moment he's scanning the skies for enemy aircraft, throttle wide open, engine roaring. The next, his controls go slack. The stick feels wrong in his hands. He pulls back. Nothing. Pushes forward. Still nothing. His fighter begins a gentle, inexorable descent, utterly unresponsive to his increasingly frantic inputs. Below him, the patchwork fields of occupied Holland tilt and spin. He has perhaps 2 minutes to decide whether to ride the aircraft down or bail out over enemy-held territory. There is no explosion, no tracers stitching through his canopy, no warning at all. Just silence, and the sickening realization that he is no longer flying his aircraft. He is merely a passenger in a metal coffin. The weapon that has doomed him makes no sound. It leaves no visible trace in the air. It weighs less than a kilogram and was designed in a nondescript building in Hertfordshire by men whose names would never appear in newspaper headlines. Yet in the autumn of 1944, this silent killer is spreading havoc through German fighter formations across northwest Europe. Pilots report identical symptoms: sudden, catastrophic control failure with no apparent cause. Some manage emergency landings in fields. Others are less fortunate. German intelligence officers pore over the wreckage, searching for evidence of a new British weapon. They find nothing conclusive. The tool that is bringing down their fighters is so simple, so elegantly vicious, that even when they hold the remnants in their hands, they struggle to understand how it works. This is the story of Operation Braddock, the deployment of a device so classified that most Allied aircrew never knew it existed, and so effective that the Germans could not believe the British had actually built it. It represents a peculiar branch of warfare, not the thunderous application of explosive force, but the quiet application of scientific principle to achieve mechanical catastrophe. In the history of aerial combat, few weapons have been so devastatingly simple or so completely forgotten. By the autumn of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical juncture. Allied bombers were pounding German industrial centers with increasing ferocity, but German fighter defenses remained stubbornly effective. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced, certainly, but the fighters themselves were becoming more capable. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the latest variants of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 could still savage bomber formations that lacked adequate escort. More worrying still were reports filtering back about the jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262, an aircraft that could simply fly past conventional Allied fighters with contemptuous ease. The conventional solution to enemy fighters was straightforward: shoot them down. British and American fighters were becoming very good at this, equipped with powerful engines, multiple machine guns or cannon, and increasingly sophisticated gun sights. Between June and September 1944, Allied fighters claimed over 3,000 German aircraft destroyed. But these victories came at a cost. Every dogfight consumed fuel, ammunition, and time. Every engagement carried the risk of losing one's own aircraft to a lucky burst of fire or a mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. The bombers, meanwhile, needed constant protection. The mathematics were unforgiving. There were never enough escort fighters to cover every mission, never enough ammunition to guarantee that every enemy interceptor would be destroyed before it reached the bomber stream. What the RAF needed was a way to neutralize German fighters that required no fuel expenditure, no complex aerial maneuvering, no risk to Allied pilots. Ideally, it would work regardless of whether Allied fighters were present in the area at all. The concept seemed impossible. How do you destroy an enemy aircraft without being anywhere near it? The answer, developed in conditions of extreme secrecy, lay not in increasing the destructive power of existing weapons, but in understanding the vulnerabilities inherent in the aircraft themselves. The solution emerged from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, where a small team led by physicist Dr. James Drummond had been investigating what he termed mechanical sabotage through environmental contamination. Drummond was an unusual figure for wartime military research, a Cambridge-educated chemist who had spent the 1930s working for Imperial Chemical Industries on industrial lubricants. When war broke out, his expertise in fluid dynamics and polymer chemistry made him an obvious recruit for more clandestine applications. The principle he proposed was disarmingly simple. German fighters, like all aircraft of the period, relied on hydraulic systems to operate their control surfaces. These systems used specialized fluids that needed to maintain specific viscosity characteristics across a wide temperature range, from the freezing cold of high altitude to the operational heat generated by the hydraulic pumps themselves. If that fluid could be contaminated with a substance that would alter its properties, ideally in a delayed fashion, so the sabotage would manifest only after takeoff, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The challenge lay in creating a compound that met several contradictory requirements. It needed to be stable at room temperature, remaining liquid and inert for months if necessary. It needed to be visually and physically indistinguishable from standard hydraulic fluid, matching not just the color but the density, viscosity, and even the smell. It needed to activate reliably under flight conditions, but not during ground testing. And critically, it needed to work regardless of which specific hydraulic fluid the Germans were using, as different aircraft types and different air bases used different suppliers and formulations. Drummond's team synthesized a compound they designated LQ7, a silicon-based polymer that remained inert at ground temperatures but activated rapidly when subjected to the heat and pressure cycles of flight. The breakthrough came in March 1944, after 7 months of experimental work and more than 100 failed formulations. The compound was built around a chain of silicon and oxygen atoms that remained loosely bonded at temperatures below 35 degrees Celsius. Above that threshold, in the presence of the mechanical shearing forces generated by hydraulic pumps, the chains began to cross-link, forming an increasingly rigid three-dimensional lattice structure. The process was catalyzed by trace metals commonly found in hydraulic systems: iron from the pump housings, copper from the piping. The saboteur compound was essentially weaponizing the aircraft's own components against itself. At room temperature, LQ7 was a clear liquid with a faint amber tint, virtually indistinguishable from standard hydraulic fluid. Its density was 0.876 grams per cubic centimeter, carefully matched to German Type 5 606 hydraulic fluid. Its viscosity at 20 degrees Celsius was 13.5 centistokes, again within the normal range for aviation hydraulics. A German ground crew member who inadvertently mixed LQ7 with legitimate hydraulic fluid during routine maintenance would notice nothing amiss. The fluid would flow normally, pour normally, feel correct to the touch. But once heated above 40 degrees Celsius and subjected to pressure fluctuations, the compound underwent a molecular transformation. It became viscous, then gel-like, then effectively solid. The process was irreversible and took approximately 20 to 30 minutes to complete. Enough time for an aircraft to take off, climb to altitude, and be fully committed to its mission. An aircraft taking off with contaminated hydraulic fluid would fly normally for perhaps a quarter of an hour. The pilot would notice nothing unusual during pre-flight checks or takeoff roll. Then the controls would begin to stiffen, then they would fail entirely. The beauty of the weapon lay in its simplicity. LQ7 was manufactured at a converted textile mill in Lancashire, produced in batches of roughly 50 liters at a time. The production numbers remain partially classified, but estimates suggest that between August and December 1944, approximately 12,000 liters were produced. The compound was stable, non-volatile, and could be stored indefinitely in sealed containers. Most importantly, It could be deployed by anyone who could gain access to an aircraft on the ground. No specialized training was required. No complex equipment was needed. A single operative with a 500 milliliter bottle could contaminate enough aircraft to paralyze an entire fighter squadron. Distribution was handled through SOE networks across occupied Europe. The bottles were small, cylindrical, unmarked save for a tiny code stamped into the base. They were delivered to resistance groups with minimal instruction. Gain access to German air bases. Introduce the contents into the hydraulic systems of parked aircraft. Withdraw. The dosage required was minuscule, approximately 50 milliliters per aircraft, poured directly into the hydraulic reservoir or injected through access panels. The contamination was undetectable by the standard pre-flight checks German ground crews performed. By the time the fluid began to transform, the aircraft would be airborne. The first documented use of LQ-7 occurred on the night of the 17th of August, 1944, when members of the Dutch resistance gained access to a Luftwaffe airfield near Arnhem. The operation was led by a former mechanic named Willem van der Berg, who had worked at the airfield before the occupation and knew its layout intimately. Working in darkness, they contaminated 16 Focke-Wulf FW-190s, using pipettes to introduce the compound through hydraulic filler caps. The entire operation took less than 40 minutes. The following morning, all 16 aircraft took off as part of a scheduled patrol. Within 40 minutes, 12 had crashed. 3 others made emergency landings, their pilots reporting total hydraulic failure. One aircraft, by chance or exceptional pilot skill, landed successfully despite having completely unresponsive controls, the pilot effectively dead-sticking the fighter onto the runway with engine power alone. German investigators examined the wreckage and the surviving aircraft, but found no evidence of sabotage beyond the failed hydraulic systems themselves. They attributed the disaster to a bad batch of hydraulic fluid from their own supply chain, exactly the conclusion the British had hoped for. A second major deployment occurred in October 1944 at an airfield outside Venlo, where Belgian resistance operatives contaminated an estimated 23 aircraft over the course of 3 consecutive nights. The Germans, by this point increasingly paranoid about sabotage, had increased security measures, but the resistance adapted. One operative posed as a Luftwaffe mechanic using forged documents. Another bribed a German guard with black market cigarettes. The contaminations occurred during routine maintenance periods when access panels were already open and ground crews were distracted by the complex logistics of keeping an undermanned airbase operational. Records of a particularly devastating incident come from the diary of a German pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Becker, whose account was recovered after the war. On the 3rd of November, 1944, Becker took off from an airfield near Dusseldorf in a Bf-109 G6. His entry describes normal takeoff procedures, a climb to 3,000 meters, and then the horrifying realization that his control stick was becoming progressively stiffer. Quote, "Like pushing through cold treacle, then it stopped moving altogether. I radioed the tower. They told me 2 other aircraft were reporting the same problem. We were ordered to return immediately. I could not turn the aircraft. I could only fly straight." Becker managed to bail out at altitude and survived with minor injuries. His aircraft crashed in a forest. 2 other pilots that day were not as fortunate. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German pilots began reporting unexplained control failures with increasing frequency. Some suspected mechanical sabotage but could not identify the vector. Others blamed faulty maintenance or inferior replacement parts as German industry came under increasing strain. The uncertainty was corrosive. Every takeoff became an exercise in suppressed anxiety. Pilots who survived control failures often refused to fly the same aircraft twice, convinced it was cursed. Some requested transfers to bomber or transport units. Ground crews triple-checked hydraulic systems, replaced fluids prophylactically, and still the failures continued. The weapon's greatest strength was its inscrutability. Because the contamination was invisible and the failure mechanism delayed, cause and effect could never be definitively linked. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Right, back to it. The Germans were not the only ones developing hydraulic sabotage methods, though their efforts were less sophisticated and hampered by the Reich's deteriorating chemical industry. German intelligence, specifically Abteilung II of the Abwehr, had experimented with contaminating British fuel supplies with sugar-based compounds that would caramelize in engine cylinders, but these were detectable through standard fuel testing procedures and could be filtered out relatively easily using fine mesh screens. They also developed a glycerol-based compound intended to contaminate aircraft coolant systems, causing engines to overheat, but deployment was limited and results were inconsistent. The fundamental problem with German sabotage chemistry was that it focused on immediate, obvious failure. An engine seizing or catching fire was dramatic, but also immediately attributable to sabotage, which put agents at greater risk and allowed the enemy to take countermeasures. The Americans developed a similar silicon polymer designated AS4 under the auspices of the Office of Strategic Services Chemical Warfare Division in early 1944. On paper, AS4 was comparable to LQ7 in its mechanism of action, silicon chains that cross-linked under heat and pressure. In practice, it suffered from significant limitations that made field deployment problematic. AS4 required refrigerated storage below 5 degrees Celsius to remain stable. Above that temperature, it would begin to polymerize prematurely, rendering it useless within days. This meant that operatives would need access to refrigeration equipment in the field, which was obviously impractical for clandestine operations. Additionally, AS4 had a distinctive sharp, acrid odor that experienced German mechanics might notice when opening hydraulic reservoirs. The compound was tested in limited operations in France and Italy, but was ultimately judged too unreliable for widespread use. By contrast, LQ7 remained stable at ambient temperatures up to 30 degrees Celsius and could be stored in ordinary glass bottles for months without degradation. The British compound represented the state-of-the-art precisely because it had been designed from the outset for clandestine use by non-specialists in uncontrolled environments. Drummond's team had consulted extensively with SOE training officers who understood the realities of resistance operations. They knew that agents would not have access to laboratory equipment, refrigeration, or even consistently clean containers. The compound had to be foolproof. It had to work the first time, every time, regardless of the operator's technical knowledge or the conditions under which it was deployed. This design philosophy, prioritizing operational reliability over theoretical performance, was characteristic of British special operations equipment throughout the war. Comparative analysis of the German and British approaches reveals the difference in strategic thinking. German sabotage efforts focused on direct, immediate destruction, explosives hidden in fuel tanks, incendiary devices planted in hangars. These were dramatic and occasionally effective, but they required significant infrastructure and specialist training. The British approach was subtler and, ultimately, more devastating. LQ7 could be deployed by a single individual with minimal training and no equipment beyond the bottle itself. The delayed action meant the operative would be long gone before the sabotage manifested. Most crucially, the Germans could not defend against it because they could not identify it as an attack in the first place. Production numbers of contaminated hydraulic fluid are difficult to verify with certainty. Surviving SOE records suggest that approximately 900 separate deployments occurred between August 1944 and March 1945, when the program was scaled back as Allied forces overran German airfields. If we assume an average of 5 aircraft contaminated per deployment, that suggests roughly 4,500 German aircraft were affected. Not all would have crashed. Some pilots managed emergency landings, others aborted takeoffs, when they noticed sluggish controls during ground tests. But even if only a third resulted in total losses, that represents 1,500 aircraft removed from the German order of battle without firing a shot. The actual impact is almost impossible to quantify, precisely because the weapon's success depended on remaining invisible. German loss records from late 1944 are incomplete and often attribute crashes to mechanical failure or unknown causes without further detail. British intelligence officers who reviewed captured German maintenance logs after the war noted a sharp increase in hydraulic system failures beginning in September 1944, but these entries rarely provided enough detail to confirm LQ-7 as the cause. What is clear is that German fighter availability declined precipitously during this period, and not all of that decline can be attributed to combat losses or fuel shortages. The legacy of LQ-7 extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. The concept of delayed action chemical sabotage influenced post-war thinking about unconventional warfare. Modern militaries maintain stockpiles of compounds designed to degrade lubricants, corrode metal components, or contaminate fuel supplies, all descended conceptually from Drummond's wartime work. The principle remains unchanged. Understand the system, identify the critical dependency, introduce the silent killer. Aircraft hydraulic systems are now more redundant and better protected, but the vulnerability remains. A sophisticated adversary with access to the supply chain could theoretically introduce contaminants that would not manifest until aircraft were operational. The fact that such attacks are rare speaks more to the difficulty of penetrating modern security than to any fundamental impossibility. Surviving examples of LQ-7 are extraordinarily rare. The compound was classified until 1974, and most stocks were destroyed after the war. A single bottle, recovered from a resistance cache in the Netherlands, is held in the collections of the Imperial War Museum, but is not on public display. The formula itself remains partially classified. The British government has released the general composition but not the specific synthesis process, presumably to prevent replication. Dr. Drummond published one cryptic paper on polymer behavior under thermal stress in 1947, but never publicly acknowledged his wartime work. He died in 1983, his contribution to the war effort known only to a small circle of colleagues and intelligence officers. 23rd of September, 1944, somewhere over the Netherlands. The Messerschmitt is descending through scattered clouds now, the pilot having made his decision. He will attempt a belly landing in a field, hoping to walk away, hoping to return to his unit and fly again. He does not know that his hydraulic fluid has transformed into a solid mass, that his controls are welded shut by invisible bonds of silicon polymer. He does not know that he is one of perhaps dozens of German pilots experiencing identical failures on this particular day, that the failure is not mechanical chance but deliberate design. He pumps the stick uselessly, tries the rudder pedals, feels nothing. The field rushes up, the aircraft impacts hard, cartwheels, breaks apart. He survives, bruised and shaken. In the weeks to come, he will tell his story to anyone who will listen, will insist that his aircraft was sabotaged, will be met with polite skepticism. The ground crews found nothing wrong with the wreckage beyond the failed hydraulics. Manufacturing defect, they tell him. Bad luck. But luck had nothing to do with it. The weapon that destroyed his fighter weighed 800 grams, cost approximately 3 pounds to manufacture, and made no sound at all. It was designed by men whose names would never grace monuments, deployed by operatives who would never receive decorations, and killed with a silence more complete than any explosion. In the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, it represented near-perfect efficiency, maximum impact, minimum risk, total deniability. The forgotten weapon that destroyed German fighters was not a gun or a bomb. It was a bottle of clear liquid and the terrible understanding of what happens when the things we depend upon fail in ways we cannot predict or prevent. That understanding won battles. It saved lives. And then, like so much of the secret war, it disappeared into archives and fading memories, its work complete, its silence absolute.